the APICS Inland Empire chapter. Today our presenter is John W. Tulac. He is an attorney. He's had over 37 years of active law practice, 30 of which he's been an arbitrator and a mediator, as well as 10 years as a judge pro tem. And he is an expert in the field of international law. So today he's going to talk about supply chain disruptions. So if your supply chain originates in China or a nearby country, chances are your supply chain will be disrupted, which would result from international issues in China, access to transit through the South China Sea, or a trade war with China, or even a shooting war with North Korea. So he's going to discuss all that today. And again, thank you for attending. And John, you can take it from here.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And thank you also to Lisa Anderson for inviting me to speak today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I have been involved with dealing with China since 1980-81. As a very young lawyer, I got a deal done in China, and it changed my entire career path. So despite the fact that I've been dealing with China for all these years, it continues to amaze and sometimes confuse, confound, and anger me in terms of how China behaves. It is also a fascinating country with wonderful people and has built up an incredible infrastructure to provide for companies in China to be able to produce massive quantities of goods and export them around the world. But unfortunately, a lot of that is changing. And the purpose of today's presentation is to look at how China is today and to be aware of some of the things that could, on very short notice, dramatically alter the supply chain. So a bit of a scary type of headline, Wither China Supply Chain Apocalypse, but that is designed to get everybody's attention. So next slide, please. Why do this? Why talk about this? It's because what happens in China has both direct and indirect impacts on the world as a whole and on U.S. businesses in particular. Even mom and pop businesses on Main Street, USA, are so directly connected with what gets produced in China, and therefore need to pay attention to what goes on in China. Because if the typical retail shop were to take an inventory of where the goods originate, they would find that their shelves are filled with goods from China. So imagine what would happen if that supply chain that they weren't paying any attention to because they're buying their goods from US distributors. Imagine that's interrupted. What happens in short order to those retail shelves? As they start getting bare, you start looking for alternatives, and you find that you may not be able to get them right away. The alternatives may not be there. So it makes a lot of sense to regularly check on what your supply chain actually looks like and the things that can impact it. Next slide, please. So that's why it's important for U.S. business to know what happens in China and how what happens in China can impact them. Now that's true for the day-to-day things that would just be commercial in nature, business in nature. But we also know that today Asia is a hot spot. We have a crazy person running North Korea, threatening the United States. We have China asserting very aggressively territoriality in the South China Sea. We have other issues in Asia that don't get a lot of attention here in the United States, but are important to the Asian countries vis-a-vis China. And so US companies need to monitor key changes, developments, and trends in China on a regular basis to know what potential impact those things might have on their businesses. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at how China is doing. Just a brief overview of economic performance before we go back into supply chain issues in detail. China probably failed to achieve its economic goals for 2016. It certainly failed in 2014 and 2015. Growth target, however, has stayed at 6.9% now for 2 years, and China has, surprisingly, no surprise, reported quarterly growth at 6.9% for 6 straight quarters. That's entirely made up. Data scarcity is a major problem in terms of understanding what's going on in China. Data in China is poorly collected, it's poorly defined, it's often falsified, and whatever data is being used by the Chinese government is being manipulated. And there's virtually no transparency. Unless we're able to intercept and get directly evidence that we are interested in evaluating, we are forced to make do with what is reported officially, and we're forced to make do with secondary types of evidence, such as the performance of Chinese stock markets and other things, to try and make real economic assessments and projections. No surprise, we can be wildly wrong about that. And no surprise, when you have bad data or incomplete data, or you start to believe you're manipulated data, you as a government, in this case now China, can make bad decisions. Next slide, please. So what do we expect next? It's possible that, error here, that China may achieve its growth target for 2017 because it's still very strong relative to virtually every other country in the world. But there are so many things working against China right now internally that it's difficult to believe that they'll meet their target. And any number of these things, and we'll go through those in just a moment, could seriously disrupt China's ability to reach its growth target for 2016. For one thing, it can't continue to spend money like it's doing, such as on infrastructure. You have major growth cities with literally hundreds of apartment buildings that have been built and are completely empty. China this year has significantly spent down its foreign reserves. 75% of its foreign reserves have been spent in the last year and a half. And there are some analysts who believe that China may be functionally broke in terms of foreign reserves before the end of the year. And again, we would probably not be able to see that directly, but we would be able to imply that directly by changes in how China manages its accounts. So part of this we've been able to see coming for some time: foreseeable growing pains as China transitions from an export-driven production economy to a consumption economy. There's going to be some pain in that transition. Overall, there are some good reasons to remain bullish on China, but we have to exercise great caution in terms of how we may want to take advantage of that. So great risks, can sometimes also generate great opportunities. So let's look at the known risks. Next slide, please. These are the unsustainable time bombs ticking in China today. The first is massive debt. And if you think our debt is bad and we're not doing a great job of managing it here, the debt ratios in China are much, much worse. And there's no known plan for how China is going to handle this increasing debt obligation on multiple levels that China has. Already we're seeing that private debt is increasingly unmanageable for a lot of the small to medium-sized Chinese companies. As things turn down in terms of export opportunities, they're not going to be able to manage their debt very well. And a number of companies have already closed. Most of those have closed because they have simply produced so much. There's an oversupply of what they've produced. There was a poignant picture in the LA Times last year of a company in China in one of the interior cities that had produced these massive concrete pipes. And there's a picture of the owner sitting on the floor in the warehouse. He has laid off all his workers, and the warehouse is full of these pipes, unsold. He's out of business. Second thing is capital flight and how China has responded with capital restrictions. Now, I use the term capital flight broadly because big Chinese companies in particular have accumulated a lot of capital and have found that there's no good place to invest that capital in China for what they want to do. And so they have looked overseas, and they have found a couple of things. One is it's difficult in a lot of countries for a Chinese company to make capital investments simply because they're not considered to be a desirable investment partner. The Chinese would love to invest in Mexico in the energy sector, and Lord knows Mexico needs that investment. But Mexico has been strongly resistant to Chinese investment, particularly in the energy sector. That may change out of necessity. On the smaller level, we have seen owners of companies in China, especially small and medium-sized companies, try to get money out of China in a variety of ways. Some of that money has flowed here to the United States and has found its way into the local real estate market. But for those of you who may have any connection with real estate, you've noticed in Southern California that the Chinese buyers that were buying the more expensive properties in San Marino and Arcadia, or out here in Claremont and Rancho Cucamonga, that's virtually dried up. Why? Because the capital restrictions that China started imposing last year, and just as recently as the other day, imposed new rounds of restrictions, those restrictions are starting to have effect. And so Chinese money leaving China for legitimate business purposes, increasingly restricted. And that means that the Chinese government is trying to do is encourage the use of that capital at home. But where do you put it? We have an overbuilt infrastructure. We don't need more highways. We don't need more coal plants. They do need more energy produced, but they're trying to get away from coal because of the pollution. Not a lot of opportunity in infrastructure today, but the state-owned enterprises continue to build infrastructure because that's what they do, and the government continues to allow that. You also, in a lot of the most desirable cities, have a serious real estate bubble just waiting to burst. There's really not much opportunity for private money to go further into real estate and to sustain that market. So this is another thing that is likely to happen within a matter of months. And then you're going to see a debacle in the Chinese stock market as well. So to go back full circle to where we started with this, Chinese overcapacity is something that is hard to work out. And you see it, of course, in the form of dumping of products on foreign markets. We don't like that. We have a number of pending investigations about Chinese companies dumping. You know, the thing that's been most in the news recently has been steel, and we've had a couple of announced decisions recently about that. So, you know, nobody wants a trade war, but we do have the WTO, and the United States would be much better off using the WTO to deal with dumping issues rather than threaten China with a trade war. Why? Because if we file these petitions with the WTO, as well as using our anti-dumping mechanisms, we're likely to win all these battles. We don't need to pick a fight specifically in the form of a broader trade war. We can deal with these issues through existing mechanisms. Next slide, please. One thing that's no longer in the news, it was, of course, during the election, Trump accused China of deliberately devaluing its currency. He was only 6 or 8 months late in recognizing that China hasn't been doing that anymore. It did do that in the past. It did it deliberately in 2015 and 2016. Why? Because it knew that once it joined up as a full-fledged member of the International Monetary Fund. It was not going to be able to do that anymore. So it got out of the way beforehand, and it's behaved itself ever since. If China gets desperate, it would change its policy, but I don't see that happening in the short term. Next slide, please. What China truly needs is political reform, and that's on indefinite hold. That's not likely to change in the near future. One thing we do know for sure is that human rights violations are increasing and will continue to increase. That will add to unrest in China. It certainly has added to unrest in Hong Kong, with tens of thousands of people demonstrating in the streets because of what's happened in Hong Kong recently. A couple of the young political activists had their lenient sentences overturned, were sentenced to 5 or 6 months. That was deliberate, because if you receive a sentence of more than 5 months, it means that you are no longer eligible for 5 years to run for office. So this is a very heavy-handed way by which China is exerting control in Hong Kong. It's also worrisome for another reason, because it means that the independent Chinese judiciary, the Hong Kong judiciary, is now under real threat. It also means that the special relationship that China agreed to honor for 15 years, where Hong Kong would have a different system and rights more consistent with what was under British rule, is now looking like it's being seriously undermined. That's significant, even though Hong Kong isn't an original part of the supply chain, but it is an integral part because of Hong Kong banking and the ability of Chinese companies to have access to Hong Kong banks if some of the marketing side of the supply chain runs through Hong Kong. All that is in jeopardy, and that special relationship could mean that you have a disruption in supply chain because their marketing means no longer will work the way they expect it to. This is something that is not likely to occur in the short term, however. Next slide, please. We can kind of put economic reform in China to the sidelines as well. It will continue to proceed, but very slowly, very cautiously, and certainly not in the areas where it's needed the most, which means cleaning up the state-owned enterprises and providing more freedoms for the privately owned small and medium-sized companies. Don't expect any of that to happen in the near term. The thinking is still based on command and control in terms of dealing with the economy, and especially in terms of dealing with economic crises. As we know, based on going back to Lenin and Stalin, 5-year plans don't work. Command and control of the economy doesn't work. Our government would be well advised to learn the lessons of economic history. We are not going to be able to level the playing field or do balanced or managed trade or anything that strikes one as mercantilist any more than any other country in the world is going to be able to pull that off and make it work. This kind of interference through politics always backfires, and usually painfully so. Next slide. So let's look at the political risk. This is where supply chain can be disrupted in ways that have nothing to do with business. First, we need to understand that China is a nation that is operated by rule by law, not rule of law. That means that the law can be manipulated or even changed very arbitrarily or capriciously and with little or no notice by the government. The judiciary is not independent, so it will not interpret the law as it is supposed to be, but it will take its direction from the government. I am currently training a group of 30 very fine Chinese judges this week. I do this a couple of times a year. And the first thing that I tell them in their introduction to our US judicial system is the importance of an independent judiciary. I have to do this indirectly because there's going to be a political officer among that bunch. Everything that I say gets reported back, and every reaction that they have gets reported back. So I have to be careful here, but the message is clear. Until there is an independent judiciary, we can't rely on China to give us a judgment that we may need if something goes wrong with the supply chain and we have a cause of action. To rely on the Chinese civil system is not a good thing. Fortunately, the Chinese government has recognized for a long time now that international arbitration needs to be clean, it needs to be left alone, and it needs to be fair and independent. And more or less, mostly more, that's true today. So if you do have a problem with anything with your supply chain originating in China and you can't resolve it, the place to go resolve that is through international arbitration, not through the Chinese courts. Regulatory changes can take place with little or no notice. Those regulatory changes can sometimes negatively impact the supply chain. We also need to remember that there are no rights as we understand and practice them here in the United States. Sometimes this doesn't happen very often, and certainly not to US citizens. But if you travel, especially to inland, smaller city locations where your supply chain may originate, and you are trying to negotiate out a problem, you may find yourself hassled by the local officials. And you may have little or no ability to do something about that if they decide to make you a guest of the government for a period of time. There's just no reliable recourse if something goes wrong for you while you're inside China. We've seen more incidents of that in the last year. Very seldomly has that involved a US individual, but there's no reason that that can't happen. So when you're over there, be careful, don't do anything controversial. Always let the embassy know where you are and your lawyer. And as I tell anybody who I represent when they go overseas anywhere, I tell them behave themselves. Remember, I don't do bail. Next slide, please. We have seen an increase in internal unrest. It used to be that unrest was something that the Chinese government could keep out of the headlines because it controlled the media. With the internet today, even though that is controlled, censorship is still very high. More and more we see reports of labor unrest or demonstrations or occasional real violence, again, mostly on the interior. We see that suppressed, oftentimes brutally, but we also see it reported more often than ever before. So if your supply chain originates in a region where you have seen reported signs of political or labor unrest or ethnic unrest, again, inside China, the more you get in the interior, the more the ethnic groups are unhappy. When you see that, that's another warning sign that perhaps production where your goods are being produced could be subject to disruption. This is increasingly public, as I say. Hong Kong right now is in the news. Those changes, which are major, none of which are for the better, are signs actually that China feels very, very comfortable right now that it can impose what it wants on its people wherever these people are. So that's in Hong Kong. We're seeing that actively now. It's certainly true in rural and urban China, and we can only expect that to contribute to increased ethnic and economic strife over time. So we have to keep looking for the signs of danger for that. Next slide, please. This gets more esoteric, if you will, but we have to be concerned as we see what's unfolding in North Korea. that the Chinese military is ascendant politically right now, both politically and internally in China. And it's oftentimes not understood how significant the military is inside China. It's an economic powerhouse inside China, and a lot of things don't happen inside China without the direct approval and supervision of the military. Simple example is civil aviation. The military controls all of the airspace in China, and that means that it says what can fly and what can't fly inside China. And privately owned jets in China have a flying radius of 125 miles. That's it, 125 miles, which means that if you have a jet, you bought one, it's probably a play toy that sits in a hangar, and maybe you come and have a cocktail party inside your jet to show it off from time to time, because 125 miles for a jet, you take it up and you circle a little bit and you come back to your airport. There's not much you can do with it. The military is as important as the Communist Party. There has been some attempt at reorganizing, that's the term being used, the military. That's mostly been unsuccessful. The military is an uneasy partner with Premier Xi today. The military does not like Premier Xi's consolidation of power to himself. So true, the Chinese leadership, its version of the Politburo, does not like this. We have not seen this consolidation of power, since Mao. And there's no real organization politically that's strong enough to resist that. The only entity capable of resisting this is the military. And we don't really know to what extent there's any pushback. That's just not something we know. What we do know is that the military has been very aggressive globally and has been very vocal in terms of what Chinese foreign policy means. And that's something that you do need to pay attention to. You have to pay attention to what the military says about matters of foreign policy. You also have to take your clue from who is saying it. What is the level of the military person acting as spokesperson? If it's from the very top, then you can expect that will be something you can count on as being Chinese foreign policy. If it's a brigadier general or a high-level colonel or a field person, during maneuvers, then that's a test. That's a trial balloon to see what the reaction will be to something that is very controversial. It means that the Chinese military and oftentimes the Chinese government is testing for a reaction to see how the rest of the world will react to something. We have seen this quite often over the last 2 or 3 years with respect to the South China Sea. It started with very aggressive claims made by colonels and brigadier generals or the equivalent in the Navy. Then you started seeing Navy activity, military activity, and you started seeing higher level officials making statements about the South China Sea. So they saw no reaction, went up the scale, started actually acting on some of these statements, looking for reaction. It's a very cautious approach, while at the same time sounding very, very aggressive. It means that the Chinese government can assess and pull back or accelerate depending on the kinds of reactions that come from around the world. And so why is that important, especially in the South China Sea? Because it's a choke point. So much of the goods transit out of China through the South China Sea, but also goods from many of the other countries in Asia. And a lot of those goods, of course, are destined for the United States. If China decides to treat the South China Sea like its own lake, it could absolutely, with its Navy, stop the transit of goods. And that would, of course, create a foreign policy crisis involving the United States and many other countries in Asia. So let's take a look at the next slide. How likely is some of that stuff to happen? Chinese foreign policy is a long-term policy. Many observers believe that it's a 100-year marathon, that there's a long-term plan for world dominance. And we see evidence of that. We also see evidence that would suggest that that is not the case. Who knows? Nobody knows right now. But I do think that from a foreign policy standpoint, the US government would be well advised to believe that there is such a plan and develop our own long-term plan for dealing successfully and peacefully as a trade partner, as a foreign policy partner with China. And that takes some real work. We don't have a very good record of a long-term foreign policy. In fact, our friends in Europe have a joke, you know, the US foreign policy is cyclical. A typical long-term foreign policy is 3 weeks. And that's how our European friends think of our foreign policy. It is fair to say that we don't demonstrate a lot of long-term commitment. So let's look at the trigger points for conflict. We've talked about the South China Sea and the infamous 10-dash line, you know, saying this is where we're asserting our sovereignty. There is currently a crisis on the India-China border that's hotter than usual. Remember, several major rivers originate along the India-China border. India and China claim the border in different parts in significant measure because they want access to and control of that water that originates in those disputed areas. And so this gets virtually no attention here in the United States, but that could become serious at any time. The Russian wild card is fairly quiet at the moment, but the Chinese do not trust the Russians. The Chinese have troops massed along the border with Russia in case of Russia changing its policy and becoming aggressive. And let's face it, you got to put your Chinese troops somewhere, and that's one of the places where they put them. We have, of course, seen headlines about cyberspace attacks. The Chinese are notorious. They have some of the best cyber hackers in the world. Some of them work for the Chinese government and the military, and some of them work for themselves and for money. We have to keep in mind that cyberspace attacks, whether deliberately initiated by the Chinese government or for money by Chinese hackers, could disrupt our supply chain, could cause havoc. And then we have North Korea. Who the hell knows what's going to happen next there? It is in China's best interest to defuse that conflict. It makes no sense for the Trump administration to make China publicly act in a way that would be humiliating for it, to threaten China with a trade war while at the same time demanding that it do something about North Korea is bound to fail. This requires quiet diplomacy, it requires face-saving gestures, and it requires some quiet, none of which we have at the moment, although things have toned down in the last week or two. The last thing we need is a trade war. We certainly don't need a trade war over trade deficits. Those of you who heard me speak on this topic before know that trade deficits are virtually meaningless in terms of the overall economic picture. The fact that we run a trade deficit with China and it runs to hundreds of billions of dollars is meaningless when you consider that we deal with trillions of dollars every day moving in the capital markets, and we absolutely control the world capital markets. When we look at the total overall economic picture, when we take into account all the different moving parts of a dynamic global economy, the trade deficit, which is a created economic indicator in which we report on the basis of a statistic that really needs to be revised, we are dealing with something that truly leads to wrong-headed decision-making. our trade deficit goes down a lot if you start managing to create a trade statistic that measures all of the movement of goods, services, intellectual property, capital, and human resources between China and the United States. Take Apple, for example. Apple is a modern company in terms of how it does things. It's what we call a platform company today. Apple doesn't produce anything, but it generates some of the most interesting and wildly successful intellectual property carried out in the form of finished products of any company in the world. And how does it then produce, let's say, an iPhone? It sources from over 600 companies around the world to produce component parts that go into the iPhone. Those parts are shipped to China, and Chinese companies assemble those iPhones and then export them out to the rest of the world. It's the Apple IP in use in all these other countries with all these other companies that bring us an iPhone, that bring us an iMac, that brings us product in a way that's never been done before. To jeopardize this kind of global supply chain that is multi-country over a meaningless statistic is absolutely foolhardy. What we really need to do is to learn and understand why things work today in globalization. For example, our automobile industry has been fairly healthy in the last few years, and Hyundai and BMW and Honda produce their vehicles in the United States. These are US-made cars. Interestingly enough, parts that go into our US cars manufactured by Ford and Chevy, for example, come from Canada. Canada is not what you'd call a low-cost producer, yet it's still effective for Canada to bring successfully goods imported into the United States and make money. Another example is Germany. Germany is one of the highest cost producers in the world, yet it is probably by many measures the most successful exporting country in the world. So we don't want to get involved in trade wars. So what's next? Let's look at Chinese foreign policy. Next slide. China wants two things. It wants respect. It's a major power today. And it needs resources. It needs a lot of resources to keep its country's economy growing, its companies supplied with the things that China can't provide internally. And that's particularly with respect to commodities. So China's foreign policy is in large measure directed with respect to much of the rest of the world toward the ability to get the resources that it wants, one of which, of course, is crude oil and refined oil products. So when we look at Chinese foreign policy, look at these two things in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. Next slide. So now let's look at the supply chain risks that we can identify from the microeconomic level up to the macroeconomic level. And we've touched on a couple of these things already. If things start going wrong in China, you can expect to see increased mismanagement of small and medium-sized companies. Why? Because they haven't all acquired the management skills that we kind of take for granted thanks to people like Peter Drucker here in the United States. You can expect that they will cut corners. You will expect quality control to start to suffer. You can expect an increase in industrial accidents. Industrial accidents take place on a much larger scale in China anyhow because the regulatory law to prevent them isn't in place. You see a lot more in terms of regulatory violations in China under normal circumstances anyhow, because the infrastructure at the government level to investigate and require mitigation isn't there like it is here in the United States. So if you have mismanagement or industrial accidents or regulatory violations, decrease in quality control, all of these things can have a negative impact on what's coming out of your factory that you're doing business with in China, as it then makes its way across China to the ports and comes out. We've seen a lot of environmental related disasters increasingly reported in China. There's been a lot more transparency about that in the last couple of years. Why? Because China has finally recognized that it has to remediate, it has to clean up. And sometimes these environmental problems will stop supply. There was the big boom, the explosion that took place at one of the ports about 1.5 years ago. It was never determined exactly what caused that explosion, but it was so big that the containers that were all piled up, ready to be loaded on board ships, there was a great picture that showed the damage to those containers as a result of that explosion, all of which meant destroyed goods that did not make their way to the United States. We've touched on the ethnic and economic strife that is increasingly a potential factor of everyday life in certain parts of China. We've touched on the arbitrary and capricious rulings that China may enact in order to deal, at least temporarily, with things that it doesn't like in China. We can count on China addressing its environmental issues in ways that it's never done before, but we are only beginning to assess what impact that might have as China starts to do that, and how it may reorder some of the things on supply chain. For example, we've seen China be able to literally shut down business around Beijing in order to mitigate against one of the worst examples of air pollution in the world. They will simply shut down business. Well, if your goods are being produced in the greater Beijing area, that will mean that you won't get your goods quite as fast as you would before. China will continue, and in my opinion, will increase these kinds of shutdowns to at least temporarily abate environmental issues. And so that means that that's a risk that you need to factor into your timeline for delivery. So if you are like the Japanese and you like just-in-time delivery, I would suggest revising just-in-time for more delays that could come as a result of such shutdowns. And of course, the force majeure events that could occur because of North Korea, the South China Sea, how do you factor those in? How do we factor in a trade war? And what could come out of that? What would happen if tariffs suddenly jumped? I don't think we need to deal with those in the near term, but if the rhetoric keeps escalating, if things continue to look dicey, I think we have to factor those in. What happens if there's a Chinese recession? Sooner or later, we're going to have one. And any one of the bubbles that we talked about earlier could be the trigger for a significant Chinese recession. And that means that your less able small and medium-sized companies would have a serious risk of going out of business. If they're the ones supplying your goods, then what happens next? Well, that's what we're going to get to in just a moment. So let's look at the next slide. What are our challenges for U.S. businesses when we look at all these negative things? And you're probably thinking right now, boy, this is gloomy, Gus. This is all really, really negative. Well, that was really the point today, is to focus on the negative things. Not that every single one of these things would happen. Not that we've got apocalypse now. It's that we've got the potential for apocalypse. And so we need to be thinking about what do we do about that if these kind of things that could disrupt the supply chain could occur. So the first thing we need to be thinking about is how do we protect against our Chinese-based supply chain being interrupted through either internal or international shock. What do we do? Do we have more than one place in China that could produce our goods? And they're located in very different places. Do we look or start looking, as I believe we should, at other places to produce our goods, including reshoring or nearshoring options? You know, where else could we have our goods produced? That is a significant plan B that I'll talk more about in just a moment. One of the things that we could do as we consider those more radical solutions is, you know, can we repurpose some or all of our Chinese production for selling inside China? You know, cut our supply chain risk by selling right next door, indoors, where the goods are being produced. Maybe you have a good or set of goods that could be repurposed for that. Maybe you don't. But it is one of the options of cutting risk. Turning around and selling to China is also a way of cutting risk because Chinese middle class is growing. China views US goods as luxury or near luxury goods. There's a certain cachet to buying American in China. And so there's an opportunity that you may look at in terms of what you want to do. Next slide. We want to maintain cordial relations with the Chinese. We've talked about that. We want to avoid a new Cold War. We're moving toward that. We certainly want to avoid a hot war, whether it's over North Korea or the South China Sea. We have to be prepared for the potential, at least on a short-term basis or in certain sectors because of saber-rattling rhetoric, an economic war, some sanctions. We certainly have to be on guard against cyber war. That's already happening on a low-level scale. And so we have to look at the US government being able to manage its trigger points. We have to be prepared for the possibility that something goes wrong in China. The United States don't manage all those trigger points well. It's unfortunate that the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was not a true trade agreement. It was more of a foreign policy agreement that had trade-related features. We'd be much better off in there with all of our other friends. That is a perfect platform for containing China where necessary, but engaging positively with China in so many other ways with the strength of multiple parties. And we're not there. And since we've pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of the 29 remaining members, 6 of them have already engaged in discussions that have resulted in bilateral free trade agreements, which means that those countries and the companies in those countries now have open door free trade advantages that we in the United States, now doing business with those countries, and the companies in those countries don't have and will not have. We have a way of solving the kinds of problems that the Trump administration is concerned about, that Trump made a real part of his campaign, appealing to a base, particularly in the Rust Belt and the South. We need a real industrial policy. I don't mean that in terms of the way that the term has been used before. We need education and training for our high school students, our college students, particularly in the community colleges, and those workers who have been displaced by globalization, so that they get the needed training to take the 5 million jobs that exist today in the United States that are not filled. We also need a policy that encourages, as part of our social floor, to help people who have been displaced, by globalization to relocate to where the jobs are. And we need to then put these things together in terms of a policy that would encourage a manufacturing renaissance here in the United States that works with our very strong intellectual property development, that works with the high tech and high level jobs that we are creating here in the United States that are going unfilled. We have a complete failure by both the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of addressing what's necessary at the federal, state, and local level to make that a reality. There's something for us all to think about and start complaining to our political officials about. Next slide, please. So what is our plan B? Do we have one? If the supply chain were to disrupt today or next week or next month, how will your company deal with it? Why don't you have a plan B? Where is your secondary source of supply if China disrupts? If you are really concerned that China eventually will disrupt, where would you rather be in terms of originating your supply chain? I would make a very serious case for Mexico. Mexico is already on parity on all-in costs with China. Remember, Chinese wage rates have risen dramatically, and especially in the last couple of years, quite rapidly. So Mexico today offers a very, very good nearby alternative. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but what about the druggie problem, and what about the violence and all this stuff? Well, you're not going to see that along the border where the maquiladora plants are. You're not going to see it in Monterrey or all the other industrial cities where you have a highly trained, well-educated, well-developed Mexican labor force that knows how to do business. They know how to build things. They can expand dramatically given the opportunity. And we've had net migration of Mexican workers who come here illegally to the United States returning to Mexico. Maybe we need to build a wall to keep them from coming back. No, we didn't. We didn't say that. We certainly didn't mean it. Mexico's problem with migrant workers are workers coming from the other Central American republics looking for a better opportunity, either in Mexico or transiting through Mexico into the United States. So a significant plan B could be looking at Mexico. Believe it or not, another place to look at plan B is Japan. Japanese labor is, of course, highly trained. Japanese wages have been fairly stagnant, and Chinese labor rates are also approaching Japan's labor rates. So Japan merits another look in terms of a place to have your goods produced. Now, there are all kinds of other cultural issues that would be involved in doing that, but Japan is an ally. It's stable. It has well-managed companies, large and small. There's an opportunity there, in my opinion. Third plan B location is Canada. It is not the low-cost producer of the world, but it is next door, and just like Mexico, you can have production under NAFTA, which means that you're going to have a pretty much open border, no tariffs, obviously, as long as you comply with your rules of origin requirements for component parts. So Canada can provide another viable plan B. And then the final possible plan B is the reshoring option. There is a strong trend right now to want to buy American, at least in certain parts of the country. I mean, we here in Southern California who love Japanese cars, whether they're made here or made in Japan, don't experience that quite the same way as other parts of the country. But there are a lot of people who will pay a somewhat higher price to have a made in the USA label on it. And one of the things that some of our biggest importers, or at least retailers that rely on distributors that are importers, and Walmart would be the biggest one. They are all actively looking at Buy American plans. But we have to be careful here, because an overt country policy, in other words, a federal policy to Buy American, and we have a couple of those laws, actually does violate our treaty obligations and potentially our WTO obligations. So if there is to be a Buy American Plan B that is legal, it means that the Plan B originates with a Build American that originates with companies, not with government. And so I would encourage companies that may have the ability to do that cost effectively to look at the reshoring option. So next slide, please. There's so much more that we can talk about, but we're just about out of time for our hour. So if you want more, if the slides aren't being distributed as a result of this through your organization, send me an email request. I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides. You can sign up for our, I call it a free monthly newsletter. We've been revising our website, so the newsletter hasn't gone out monthly lately, but it will be resuming shortly as our website work gets done. You can follow our updates on Twitter and LinkedIn. China is always in the news, so there's something to report. And last slide, this is how you get a hold of me on the last slide with the contact information. So that is it for today. I actually finished a couple of minutes ahead of time. I'm surprised at that, because I usually can talk forever about this stuff. Thank you very much for the invitation again. I hope this was useful to you. I wish you absolutely the best of luck with your supply chain and supply chain management, wherever it originates, and look forward to being again with you sometime soon.